The life and thoughts of Paul Tillich, the man who made existentialism cool before it was cool and turned theology on its head faster than you can say ground of being. This isn't your grandma's Sunday school lesson. It's a journey through the depths of human existence, the heights of divine mystery, and everything in between. So grab your favorite existential crisis and maybe a stiff drink. I.W. Harper 15 year, anyone? Because we're entering the world of a man who dared to ask, what if God isn't a bearded guy in the sky, but the very ground of our existence? Spoiler alert, things are about to get weird. So our story begins in the twilight of the 19th century on August 20th, 1886 in a little town called Starzettel in what was then Prussia, now part of Poland. And so it's a world of handlebar mustaches, steam engines, and enough existential angst to fuel 1,000 French cafes. And into this world, little Paul Tillich was born, the son of a Lutheran pastor. And young Paul was a precocious kid, with a mind sharper than a German philosopher's critique and a curiosity that would lead to some of the most important theological writings of the 20th century. And so by the time he hit his teens, he was already wrestling with the big questions of life, death, and everything in between. He skipped the what I want to be when I grow up phase and went straight to what is the nature of being itself. But here's where the plot thickens. Because young Paul wasn't content with the simple answers his father's traditional Lutheran faith provided. No, this kid wanted to dig deeper. He wanted to probe the very foundations of existence itself. And so Tillich tore through his studies like a philosophical tornado, leaving bewildered professors and dog-eared textbooks in his wake. He earned his PhD in philosophy in 1910 and was licensed in theology in 1912. So he was collecting degrees the same way some people collect Pokemon, with passion, precision, and a slight hint of obsession no one else understands. Squirtle! Tillich wasn't content to sit in an ivory tower pondering the mysteries of the universe while the world burned around him. No, he had a date with destiny. And by destiny, we mean World War I. In 1914, he signs up as a chaplain in the German army. Bit of a career change. 1 minute, you're debating the nature of being. The next, you're dodging bullets and trying to explain to shell-shocked soldiers. Try saying that 5 times fast. Why does God allow war? And so the war ends up leaving an indelible mark on him. He emerged from the trenches with a case of PTSD and a burning question. How could one speak of God in a world that had such horror? It was like he stared into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back at him, holding a copy of Nietzsche's God is Dead. Now, once back in civilian life, he threw himself into the intellectual ferment of post-war Germany. He became part of a group of religious socialists, trying to blend Christian faith with socialist politics. So he was attempting to create a theological smoothie with Marx, Jesus, and a dash of existential despair, cherry on top. But here's where our story takes a bit of a dark turn. While he was busy trying to revolutionize both theology and politics, a madman was rising to power in Germany. Enter Adolf Hitler, stage right. And he wasn't about to sit idly while the Nazis took over. He spoke out against their ideology, writing articles and giving speeches that criticized the Nazi regime. It was David taking on Goliath, but instead of a slingshot, he had philosophical arguments. I guess the pen is mightier than the sword. And in 1933, Tillich becomes the first non-Jewish professor to be dismissed from his academic post by the Nazis. It turns out the Third Reich wasn't too keen on professors who questioned their authority. Who would have thought? And this dismissal led to perhaps the most unexpected plot twist in Tillich's life, his exile to America. Thanks to the efforts of Reinhold Niebuhr, another theological heavyweight, he was offered a position at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Think of it as a theological version of the Witness Protection Program: new country, new language, and new intellectual landscape. But here's the kicker. Tillich, who barely spoke English when he arrived, would go on to become one of the most influential theologians in America. And so what we find is that in America, his thoughts really begin to crystallize. He developed his method of correlation, which sought to answer existential questions with theological answers. He was building a bridge between the depths of human angst and the heights of divine mystery. And his magnum opus, Systematic Theology, was published in 3 volumes between 1951 and 1963. It was the Lord of the Rings of theology, epic in scope, dense in content, and filled with ideas that would spawn countless interpretations and debates. But Tillich wasn't just writing for other theologians. His book, Courage to Be, became a bestseller, bringing his ideas to a much wider audience. It was like he had taken all the angst of existentialism and all the mystery of theology and somehow turned it into a self-help book. Bye-bye, Dale Carnegie. Now, you might think that a German exile writing dense philosophical theology wouldn't cause much of a stir, but you'd be wrong. His ideas were revolutionary, and not everyone happened to be on board. So his concept of God was that of the ground of being, rather than a supernatural being out there, somewhere. It was sort of like he had taken the theological rug out from under everyone's feet, because his idea was that doubt is an essential part of faith. So it was enough to give any Sunday school teacher a conniption. And don't even get me started on his views of symbolism and myths in religion. He argued that religious language was symbolic, pointing to truths beyond itself. Hey, all those religious stories you've been taking literally, yeah, well, they're just really profound metaphors. Cue the collective gasp from fundamentalists everywhere. But perhaps most controversial, he believed that there is truth in all religions and even in secular philosophies. Now, despite, or perhaps because of his controversial ideas, he became something of a celebrity in the 50s and 60s. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1959, a feat usually reserved for movie stars and politicians, not balding German theologians with sad eyes. And so Tillich was suddenly in demand everywhere. Universities, churches, talk shows. It was like watching a rock star tour if the rock star was more likely to quote Heidegger than smash guitars. He even had groupies. Okay, they were more likely to be theological graduate students flinging their courage to be on stage. But fame came with its own challenges. Because how does one maintain intellectual integrity while also being a public figure? How does one translate complex philosophical ideas for a mass audience without dumbing them down? And so Tillich was walking a tightrope between academia and popular culture, with the abyss of misunderstanding yawning below. Now, Tillich was a complex figure, full of contradictions and full of very human struggles. So despite his philosophical brilliance, he struggled with depression throughout the majority of his life. And there was his personal life. Tillich's marriage was, to put it mildly, unconventional. He and his wife Hannah had an open relationship which scandalized some and fascinated others. He was living out his philosophical principles of openness and authenticity in his personal life, for better or for worse. He was also known for his love of nature and art. He could wax poetic about a piece of abstract expressionism or a walk in the woods with the same enthusiasm he brought to discussions of ontology and eschatology. So Paul Tillich died on October 22nd, 1965, but his ideas lived on. His influence can be seen in fields as diverse as theology, philosophy, psychology, even pop culture. And so he was planting intellectual seeds that are still bearing fruit today. His concept of God as the ground of being has inspired countless theologians and seekers to rethink their understanding of the divine. His method of correlation continues to shape how many approach the relationship between faith and culture, and his insistence on the importance of doubt in faith has comforted many a struggling believer. But perhaps Tillich's greatest legacy is the way he encouraged people to ask big questions and not settle for easy answers. He was giving permission for people to doubt, to question, to wrestle with the deepest issues of existence, and to see that wrestling was a profoundly spiritual act. And so his life and work, it poses a challenge to all of us. In a world that can often seem absurd, meaningless, or just plain confusing, how will we find the courage to be? Will we dare to ask the big questions even when we know the answers might shake us to our core? And will we have the audacity to see the divine, in the midst of our messy, complex, all too human lives. Because in the end, Tillich's story isn't just history, it's an invitation. It's like he's reaching out from the past, grabbing us by our existential collar and saying, wake up, your existence is showing. So as we step back from our whirlwind tour of his life and thought, we're left with a sense of unfinished business. His questions about the nature of being, the meaning of faith, and the human condition are perhaps even more relevant today than they were in his time. Because we live in an era of AI, virtual reality, space exploration, and what does it really mean to be human? In a world facing climate crisis and political upheaval, where do we find the courage to be? Tillich's work reminds us that theology and philosophy, they're not just academic exercises. They're matters of life and death, meaning and meaninglessness. It's like he's challenging us from beyond the grave, saying, you've heard my ideas. Now what are you going to do with them? After all, as Tillich himself might remind us, when it comes to the ultimate questions of existence, it's not about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to live out the questions.